Massive thank you as always to patrons Sarah Turner, Rebecca Johns and Justin Harper. And this week's random call out goes to patron KJ Gould. You can support us too at patreon.com/it's not just in your head, or follow us on social media and help spread the word.
In the mental health field, too often, we've made it seem as if it's just in your head.
The landlord can hijack the rent by 20%. That impacts people's mental health.
Can't have a profit-driven mental health care system if we want our people to be connected and healthy.
Today, our podcast of It's Not Just in Your Head is about the issue of what is Marxian analysis and whether or not it can help us know what's going on in our personal lives. Some of the guests we've considered having here, and probably will, think that all Marxism exists to help us with, which is quite a bit, is the economy outside the house, is the industries, the large economic forces of our society. Well, that is one kind of Marxism, just like there's lots of different kind of capitalism. Capitalism is one thing in Brazil. It's another thing in the United States. You could certainly say with confidence that they're both capitalist countries. France is a capitalist country, albeit with a big socialist and communist influence, but it's still a capitalist country. The same thing with the Scandinavian countries and Germany. Sweden is a capitalist country. However, capitalism is controlled there by a huge left, communist, socialist, anarchist presence. The same is true in the rest of Scandinavia. So when we talk about capitalism, we're not talking about one thing. And when we talk about socialism or Marxism, we're also not talking about one thing. We're talking about a whole bunch of possibilities. And what I want to talk about is a possibility for Marxism, which I find tremendously helpful. And that is Marxism looks at class, primarily at class. And class answers questions. It answers basically three questions when you look at class. One question is, who does the work? Another question is, who appropriates the goods from the work or the services? And who gets to distribute those goods and services? So let's say if you're working in a chair factory, one person or a whole group of people, workers, produce the chairs. The board of directors and boss receives the benefit of that labor by selling the chairs at a profit. And we have to remember parenthetically that no boss will hire you unless they're paying you less than they're getting from your work, because capitalism doesn't really allow you to pay workers without getting more for yourself out of their work than you actually give them. So you're always gypped in capitalism, but that's a little aside. In any case, who does the work? Who gets the benefit of that work? And who gets to distribute that work? So if you're making chairs, who produces the chairs? Who are the workers doing the production of the chairs? Who is the boss or board of directors appropriating those chairs and being in charge of selling those chairs and keeping a sizable amount of that money, and then distributing that money however the board of directors or the boss sees fit. The boss may decide to use the benefit that he's accrued or she's accrued from all those laborers making the chairs to find machines that can replace those workers and kick them out of their jobs. Or they may decide to invest in another product. Or if there's a huge union battle, they might decide to give some of that extra that they've gotten off of the workers to raising pay or health benefits. But it's their decision. And in that case, who produces the chairs? The workers at the chair factory. Who gets the benefit? The board of directors and the boss. And who gets to distribute the money from those chairs? Same board of directors and the boss. Okay, now, You can ask those questions about anything. You can ask it about any service. Let's say you're an owner of Maid for a Day that hires a lot of people, pays them poorly, farms them out to various clients who hire Maid for the day, and then keeps a big portion of the amount they get, gives a little portion to the maid who cleaned the house, and keeps the rest as profit for themselves and decides how to distribute it. So they're distributing the results of a service, not a good like a chair, but a service. Well, the kind of Marxism that I think is most useful, particularly as we look at personal life, is the kind of Marxism called New Marxism or Overdeterminist Marxism or Non-Essentialist Marxism. And later I'll tell you about books and journals and stuff that use that kind of Marxism. In any case, let's take that into the household. Let's ask those questions into the household and then look at the emotional ramifications of that work. The traditional US household for white people, because Black people always had to have two people working, since Black men were never paid a family wage that supported dependent wives and children. But the mass of people until really the late 70s in the United States, the overwhelming population was white. And the man worked outside the home and got a salary that would support a dependent wife and child or children. And in that case, the woman produced use values. She produced things that are useful for the man and his children, like cooked food, shopping, cleaning, ordering, ironing, and creating an environment that was comfortable and restorative for the man to go back to work. And in addition, which is very important for therapists and people interested in mental health, is she produced emotional services. She might do 3 jobs when her husband or her man comes home from work. He may be in a crappy mood because he's been pushed around on the job. So then she goes into 3 kinds of emotional service. First service, she figures out the mood he's in. Second, she does nice things to make it easy. Third, she disguises from her husband the fact that she's working hard to make his life easy because he seems to be in a bad way. Some of those services she may be providing is to ask him if he wants to talk about anything that's bothering him. And if he denies that, it's the service of shutting up about it. Or she may do the service of bringing him a glass of wine or a cup of tea, or another service telling the children to be quiet because their father just got home from a hard day of work. So she provides emotional services as well as all sorts of domestic services. And she also provides sexual services so that if he wants to have sex, she's available. She also provides social services. She connects him to friends who she invites over, their friends. She connects him often to his family because it's usually the woman in a couple with his children. She makes opportunities, arranges outings so they can go together and the man can be part of it. Or another social labor she may do is inviting his family over, doing the domestic labor to cook for them and the emotional labor to make them feel welcome, as well as the social labor of connecting him with that. If the husband has, let's say, a football game, and before COVID, they're all over there watching football together, she may provide snacks and clean up afterwards. Those are domestic services that she does to help her husband connect with his friends, a social service. So there are a lot of services going on in a household, even though no money is exchanged. In capitalism, wages are given, money is exchanged and paid for labor. Well, and also in capitalism, you can easily fire an employee. sometimes less easily because they have a good union, but you could fire an employee or an employee can quit. Quitting a marriage and an emotional commitment is a whole lot harder for both parties. And so that's a real difference. In fact, the old traditional relationship that many people hearken back to, particularly the right wing, is more like an economically feudal arrangement, because in feudalism, the serfs produced use values that they delivered to the lord, who didn't pay them a wage, but who gave them a home, like the man gives his wife, took care of the land, and rendered a portion of all their use value services to the lord of the manor, who took his third or tenth or whatever of their output to enrich himself and his court. That's a feudal arrangement, which is the traditional family and economically feudal arrangement. Well, that arrangement fell apart because capitalists outsourced millions upon millions of well-paying, often unionized jobs for white men and some black men, but overwhelmingly white men in a racist and sexist country, and replaced them with either nothing or lower paid work. Capitalism also accumulated vast amounts of money overseas. Capitalists did, because they paid at the most, the highest wages were for the Chinese, who get over $3 an hour. Whereas in Pakistan, you can pay people 99 cents an hour. So they made vast wealth, brought it back to the United States, and bought our political representatives, which made a lot of people just give up and be passive. But in any rate, they took away that opportunity. They also took it away with computers and robots. So between outsourcing computer and robotizing, masses of white men lost their jobs. They were no longer the kings of the feudal manor at home because their wives had to work. And so the wife has to enter the capitalist system for a wage in order to survive. And the cozy idea of a full-time feudal serf at home providing use values, cooked food, cleanliness, order, childcare, social services, emotional services, sexual services, was not any longer a possible full-time job for the mass of Americans, which caused a lot of domestic trouble. So it wasn't just emotionally disagreeing on things, or it wasn't what the right wing said in like Philip Murray in his book. I'm sorry, I think it's Charles Murray in his book, things. It's called Falling Apart, and it blames the problems of a white middle class family or a white family falling apart on the moral laziness and inadequacy of white men, just as in 1965, Philip Moynihan blamed the problems in the black family on the moral inadequacy and laziness of black men, which really, it was an economic deal, certainly as much as anything else, or much, much more. So what you had is the man no longer had a full-time feudal serf. The wife no longer had either the destiny of working to be pleasing to a man and be therefore sustained in her labor for him and his kids, and the woman neither had the sense of being trapped with a man or the sense of being kept by a man because full time, because that was no longer possible. And the whole terrain of marriage shifted in terms of its class formation, because women now were the initiators of divorce. 70% of divorces are now initiated by women. Wow, used to be that men initiated divorce. Most white working class women do not want to marry because they think that marriage will mean cooking, cleaning, and maintaining a white working class man after they get home from a full-time job. And that's not satisfying, or even a part-time job. That's too much work. And so they opt out. So that the personal terrain of home and family has shifted, and we can look at Marxian analyses of class to help us see why it shifted. We also can look at the class formations that happen once that shifts, that household. For the first time in history in the United States, the majority of American women are single and by choice. And that whole idea of a career, an economic career based on being pretty and attractive to a man, doesn't hold up. You're not going to be supported for life for the mass of American people. And women have other necessities and some other choices as well. And so the terrain of personal life has shifted. Of course, this doesn't explain every single thing because nothing does. And where have women gone? Let's look at other class forms that Marxism gives us. One is the independent class. I call it the independent class, but Marx called it the ancient class, which is that everybody basically works for her or himself. So women lived independently of men. They run their own households, they make their own money, they spend it however they want, on whatever they want, and they don't have anybody else that they have to take care of except children who they elect to have or not. And so that now 42% of American children are born outside of a marriage because women may want children but not the burden of taking care of a husband. That has certainly changed personal life. It's changed the personal lives of women. One of the best predictors of poverty for women in the United States is having a child, since our country doesn't support people in childbearing or child rearing. And so they're left with a huge economic burden. In fact, 2/3 of workers working for minimum wage, $7.25 usually, which they're now trying to push to $15 an hour, 2/3 of those workers are women and often single mothers. And that has changed their lives, that they've elected not to be married and have to be in a feudal position in the household. It changes gender as well, which is another personal matter. Another thing is women are deciding to change their relationships with men or other lovers. They're going into a communist or communal class process at home, where it's from each according to his ability or her ability to each according to their needs, so that men and women decide together that they're both going to work, they're going to pool their resources, and they're both going to do the emotional, sexual, social, and physical work of caring for the home and perhaps children. Wow. That's a huge change. It's a gender change. It's a change in personal life. It's an emotional change, as men and women are expecting different things from each other than they ever used to. And so that here's a way that way of looking at class really has legs into personal life. The old kind of Marxism, which is Marxism has to do with production and industry, doesn't go far enough, doesn't help us enough. And this kind of new Marxism is recognized in many ways. There's a journal that's been around for maybe 15 years called Rethinking Marxism that has articles from that viewpoint. And there's a book that I wrote about Marxism in the household. I wrote it with Richard Wolff and Stephen Resnick. So it's Fraud, Resnick, and Wolf. And it's called Class Struggle on the Home Front, where we develop Marxism in the household, class in the household. And that's based on an earlier article that I wrote called For Every Knight in Shining Armor, There's a Castle Waiting to be Cleaned. But that book is called Class Struggle on the Home Front. There's a relatively recent collection of new Marxist articles called Knowledge, Class, and Economics, Marxism Without Guarantees by Rutledge, and that came out in 2019. So in any case, that's a different kind of Marxism. And so when people say Marxism only is at work in industry, it only applies there, they're wrong. It can apply anywhere that services or products are being created, where they're being given over for someone else's benefit or for one's own benefit, and where they're being distributed, whether that's in a feudal class process where one person gets bored and a share of what they produce and the rest is appropriated by the other person, as in a traditional household. And we do have to remember that traditional households in the United States used to be even more of a feudal model. In 1925, for example, all women's work outside the home had to be given over to her husband. The only money she was allowed to keep for herself was butter and egg money. So if she made her own butter and kept chickens and gathered the eggs and actually sold them for money, she could keep some of that. Well, she could keep all of that money for butter and eggs. That was it. If she went to work in a factory, all her salary would be given over to her husband. In any case, that's the feudal form of marriage and of household. So where you see that Marx's designation of the feudal class is really important here. Then there's the independent class, where a person at home does her own everything and appropriates the goods from what she did. So she cleans the house, she lives in a clean house. She takes care of her children, she has the satisfaction that her children are well cared for, and so on. Then there's the communal class process in personal life, where people live communally. They share whatever they can, and they share emotionally and physically and psychologically in every way. And they share the fruits of their labor outside the home as well as inside the home. And I think that's a very useful way of looking at a household. It doesn't tell us everything, doesn't tell us about the psychology of the individuals in the house, but it does tell us about the form of the house and its psychological overtones. Because you may feel very differently as a woman if you're working full-time in a household to please a man on whom your whole life depends, or at least your physical life depends. Your emotional life may not depend on him. In fact, you may look to your woman friends for emotional solace and so on. But your very physical, economic existence depends on that man, which may feel secure for some women and may feel terrifying for others. It also changes the terrain, giving women in the United States permission to be considered honorable citizens if they live alone with children and do their own labor of all sorts of use-value labor and benefit from it. Also, the communal class process has very different emotional overtones if you see yourself as equal partners in a household, where you share as much as you can, and including your income from outside the house and your use value production inside the house. And so just think about it, or if you want to read further, you can read Class Struggle on the Home Front. If you're interested in that kind of Marxism per se, you could look at Richard Wolff and Stephen Resnick's book, Knowledge and Class, or Contending Economic Theories. And if you're interested in reading more about that particular analysis of class, Fraud, Resnick, and Wolff, Class Struggle on the Home Front, or Knowledge, Class, and Economics, which is a book of essays edited by Theodore Burzak, Burczak, Robert Garnett, Garnett, and Richard McIntyre, McIntyre's McIntyre. Okay, I think I've explained it. I hope I did, and I hope I get feedback from you, our audience, about whether this really does come across and makes sense.
Yeah, I guess my question or statement is this idea of separating the art from the artist, because this idea of using Marx's insights on a sort of more personal level, there's a sort of comedy angle to it, right? Because I don't know enough about Marx, but from what I do know, obviously he was just very busy writing.
Yeah.
And his wife, it sounds to me like his wife did all the work raising the kids. Now, maybe that's just all hearsay.
No,
Maybe
I
that's
think
not what happened.
he did, just as Piaget, who is a founding thinker of child development, went around studying the kids while his wife did all the work.
Mm.
Or the nurse or whatever. And of course, because Marx lived in the 1800s, there was huge housework to do. They also had a housekeeper, and his wife's sister was there too.
Right. So, and the reason I don't dismiss the idea at all is just like because even if the art and the artist don't sort of align, you can look at Buddhism, for example, the sort of founding, figure, the big daddy Buddha sort of ran out on his
Right.
wife and family, right?
Yeah.
But that hasn't stopped loads of people sort of following it as a way of being in the world.
That's right. Because you do have to separate sometimes the thinker in his personal life from the thinker in his life in the world. And you don't usually evaluate, like you don't evaluate George Washington, founder of American, quote, democracy, end quote, because he had slaves, or Thomas Jefferson, or there were 9 of the signers of the Declaration of Independence who had slaves. Whoops. Or the fact that in our free democracy, 6% of the people could vote when the Constitution was written, because they had to be white, they had to be male, and they had to have property. So, whoa.
Yeah, the thoughts have value, and maybe the actions leave a lot to be desired.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the actions are also much more a hostage to the times in which they live. Not that those ideas of women's emancipation weren't somewhat around in the 1800s. And that's true. They were, but they weren't what they were later on. And Engels, not Marx, but Engels wrote much more about the family and women's position than Marx. But even Marx said you can tell the advancement of a society by the way they treat women and children.
Right.
And the worth of a society by the way they treat those two groups. So he was aware, but I don't know what kind of a relationship he had with Jenny, his wife, but I do assume he was sitting on his ass writing all the time while she did the domestic labor with the children in the household, either by herself or as a feudal manager of the household labor of servants. I really don't know those details. But I think you do have to separate the thinker from the thoughts. I mean, Thoreau wrote very famously from the wilderness, but his mother brought him food,
I didn't know that. That's great.
Yeah. So he looked around at nature, servant of none. I am master of all I convey. Mom, where's my lunch?
Oh, dear.
Uh, so, that is a question. I don't know. We might include this humorous interaction
Yeah, that's good. That's
here
good.
at the
Yeah,
end.
but really, that was my only. That was really sort of my only sort of response or question.
Uh-huh. It's valid. And that's a
Yeah.
whole question in and of itself. you
Yeah.
know?
I think also, like, maybe another podcast would be this idea of what does a world look like without profit? Like, how does it function? What happens
Yeah.
at the minute is people justify profit because it's, the only thing that keeps everything going. And on a personal level, people justify profit because they believe they're smarter than other people and they found a way to
inherit money.
inherit money, or it's just like,
Yeah.
there's a rationality for extracting value from other people. It's like, well, I figured this out, so I deserve the winnings kind of
Right.
thing. And so it would be interesting to know, have something laid out how a world doesn't work where profit is the thing that sort of runs the engine, so to
Yeah,
speak.
and there's a lot being done on that. There's a recent Oxfam report on inequality, and there's the Piketty book that shows that capitalism breeds inequality, which destroys societies.
Right. Yeah.
So there's interesting work on that. That is a good idea. I want to thank everyone. I want to thank our listeners, all of you, for listening and hopefully passing this on. And I want to thank our Patreon members who economically support us so we can continue. And I hope you join Patreon so that we can continue to exist. Thank you so much.
By the way, listeners, if you have enjoyed anything you've heard Harriet say in this program, you will definitely enjoy Capitalism Hits Home, which is a solo program that Harriet does through Democracy at Work, which is a worker-owned cooperative that produces other great programs such as Economic Update with Richard Wolff and the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles with David Harvey. I can't recommend enough that everyone also listen to Capitalism Hits Home if you enjoy It's Not Just in Your Head.
Capitalism Hits Home is a sort of broader overhead view. It explores the way that capitalism shapes our personal lives, our psyches, our relationships, our families, and it looks particularly at the sea change in American personal life as all Americans, but the top 10 or 20% of Americans, have our security and our chance for a future become as precarious as it always was for minorities and families headed by women. It's not just in your head, and Capitalism Hits Home are definitely complementary.
And if listeners would like to check out Capitalism Hits Home, Harriet, where should they go to find it?
Either on YouTube or Democracy at Work or on my own website, harrietfraud.com.